Hey there, Sports History fan. Arnie Chapman here from the Sports History Network. Now, before you jump into this episode, I wanted to share with you an exciting giveaway we have going on with Home Field Apparel. We have a digital $50 gift card to homefieldapparel.com for one lucky fan of the Sports History Network. All you got to do is head over to sportshistorynetwork.com/giveaways to sign up. Again, that's sportshistorynetwork.com/giveaways.
Hello, this is Ross Bliley from the podcast Pigskin Tales. This podcast is sponsored by Sterling Soap Company. With products sold throughout 41 locations around the globe, Sterling Soap Company has a unique assortment of products to choose from for your loved one for the holidays. Handmade artisan soaps created by Roderick and Amanda Lovin since 2012, these products are affordable and provide great value. Act now and save on your shipping costs. If you purchase $75 or more, your shipping cost is free in the United States. Shop now online at sterlingsoap.com.
This podcast is part of the Sports History Network, your headquarters for the yesteryear of your favorite sport. You can learn more at sportshistorynetwork.com.
Hi, everybody. Dan and Andrew here with you. You're about to hear an episode that we are going to kick off now and then not actually record for another week or so. This is the fourth of our random team challenges. We've done about one of these every year or so. We started with I think it was a Utah Jazz team from the mid-80s rather. It was like the 82, 83 or the 83, 84
Yep.
Jazz.
I think it was 82, 83, yeah.
And then we did then two 21st century football teams. We did the 07 Cardinals, which was the year before they went to the Super Bowl. And then we actually ended up with a Super Bowl champion 2002 Buccaneers. So we're going to do another random drawing here and see where we end up. And just to be clear, it's MLB, NBA, and NFL. And depending on which league we get, that kind of depends what the year range is that we choose from.
Yeah, I was my fiance gave me a hard time, and she thought that we should add hockey, and then she also was adding other ridiculous sports. But it's enough of a lift to do this. So before we get into this, do you have a prediction?
I'm hoping for a baseball one because that's the one thing we haven't done yet.
Yeah, if we get another 21st century football team, we might have to gimmick this a little. But yeah, I'm going to guess that it ends up being the 75 Supersonics.
Okay.
If I'm exactly right, that's...
All right, so I have a random number generator.
You're doing it?
Do you want to do it?
I mean, I've done it in the past, but if you want to do it, that's fine too.
No, you go ahead, although you're already on the record with a prediction, so I don't know if you're to be trusted on this, but...
Well, if it's not them, I'll say I'll go on the record that they surprised me a little bit.
Okay.
All right, so go ahead.
So MLB 1, NBA 2, NFL 3, right?
Yep. All right, you ready?
Yeah, let's do it.
The result is 3. So another NFL team.
All right, and we've been starting with the NFL in 1950.
To when?
2023, because that season is the most.
1978.
1978. So let's take a look here.
At the teams, wouldn't there?
I'm sorry?
There'd be 28 teams, wouldn't there?
Yeah, because a couple of expansion teams came in 77. I think the Bucks.
76.
I think the Bucks and was it the Saints that came in and said no? Saints were there since the
Seattle.
60s.
Seattle.
Bucks in Seattle. So yeah, there's 5, 10, 15, 19, 24, 28 teams. Yeah.
All right. So do you have the standings up?
I have the standings up on Pro Football Reference just to kind of maybe frame it for a second here. This was the first championship of the Steelers' second back-to-back. They defeated the Cowboys in, that would have been Super Bowl 13, I want to say.
Yeah. Yep.
And, some interesting teams here. This was the best Patriots season in a very long time. They won the AFC East at 11-5, and then actually lost to the Houston Oilers, great Earl Campbell team that actually almost beat the Steelers to make it to the Super Bowl in the AFC Championship game in '78. Dallas and the Rams are the best teams in the NFC. Giants are not good, 6-10. Worst team in the NFL is the San Francisco 49ers. This is actually the year before they draft Joe Montana. So yeah, something a little different probably. And why don't you go ahead and dial it up?
All right. I have dialed it up, and the number we have here is number 24.
Oh, boy. That is going to be the 1978 Tampa Bay Buccaneers. That's
interesting.
Yeah, we actually, years ago, we did an episode on Tampa Bay sports, but I guess we will dive a little further into the 78 Bucks.
That would be.
Go ahead.
That's like their third year, right?
Yeah. Last year in the last year, sort of in the cellar for them. They had started at 0-14, then 2-12. And then in 78, they were 5-11. Actually, in 79, we got another team that we're getting sort of right before a good season, because in 79, they actually made it all the way to the NFC Championship. I'm just looking. The Doug Williams, future Redskin, is their leading passer. Let me just look at the starters here. Go to the roster. Yeah, nothing. Hall of Fame defensive end in Leroy Selman. Yeah, there's not a lot here that I recognize other than one of the coolest logos and color schemes in the history of sports. But all right, well, Andrew and I will do some studying, and then we'll be back in about a week for us, and then maybe a couple of minutes for you all to talk about the 78 Bucks.
All right, let's get cracking.
Cool. Talk to you soon. Hello, old sports. We are back. You heard us just a couple of seconds ago drawing up our team selection for our fourth random team challenge, and we landed on the 1978 Tampa Bay Buccaneers, and we're prepared to talk to you all about them for a little bit here tonight. Dan, back with you. Andrew, how are you doing?
Not bad. It was. I know more about the early days of the Bucs. We've done a lot of Bucs episodes and Tampa episodes in the few years, so it's a bit of a tough draw, but I think there's enough here where we can get an hour out of it, which you'd imagine is kind of the idea. So.
Yeah, we did it, as I mentioned a few minutes previous. We did an episode, one of our very early episodes on Tampa sports, and then landed on the 0-2 Bucks. I think that was our most recent random challenge before this one. But one of the things that was nice is that for the first time, I got to actually go back and listen to our podcast as part of the preparation for recording a podcast.
That was the Tampa episode from several years ago.
Yeah. So where do we want to start with this? I guess we have to give a little bit of historical background, because this was only the third year of a Buccaneers franchise, and a lot of the themes that you saw in those first 2 years of the Bucs kind of carried over to the third.
Yeah, so as early as 1974, so the last real NFL expansion, the NFL, not counting the merger, was the NFL added what? They added the Saints and the Falcons in consecutive years in 67 and 66, I believe, something like that.
Yeah, and there might have been There might have been another one because by the time that might have been it. Yeah, no, you're right. I think that was it.
And that got them to 14. The AFL went from 8 to 10. They combined the leagues. That got them to 16. The AFL went from 6 to 10. They combined the leagues in 1970 with 26 teams. And, there was always, I think the quote from Pete Rozelle was that they expected the league to have 32 teams by the end of the 70s. Now, obviously, that's the current number, which they didn't reach until 2002, I guess would have been the number. But this was the first sort of expansion in the post-merger NFL era. And in 1974 that they had 5 cities in consideration. There was Tampa, Memphis, Phoenix, Seattle, and Honolulu. Now, I mean, logistically, it wouldn't work for them to put a team in Honolulu now. I shouldn't say that. I guess they could. Haven't shows you there's a lot of reasons for that, but the other teams, Phoenix eventually got the Cardinals, and then Memphis doesn't have a team in Memphis, but there's a team in Tennessee. The Titans play in Nashville, but they announced that eventually the 2 bid winners are Seattle and Tampa Bay. And Tampa this is only the second pro sports team in Florida. I know the ABA might have had a team for a couple of years or whatever, but like in the big leagues, it's the Dolphins and then it's the Bucks. The NHL wouldn't expand to Florida for many, many years. Baseball wouldn't get into Florida until 1993. And the NBA not until the late 80s with the Heat and the Magic. So the Bucks are the second professional, major professional sports team in Florida when they entered the league in 1976.
And as you mentioned, they join along with the Seattle Seahawks. They do something really, really strange the first 2 years of this expansion. And I think they're still at a 14-game season here. So there's 28 teams in the league. And so in the first year, the Seahawks are in the NFC and the Tampa Bay Buccaneers are in the AFC West, and the Seahawks are in, I guess they're in the AFC Central, I would imagine, or the NFC Central. Let me take a look at that. So 1976, 1976, the Buccaneers are in the AFC West, and the Seattle Seahawks are in the NFC West. And then when the Bucs moved to the NFC, they're actually in the NFC Central rather than the NFC West, like Seattle had been. So a little bit of an interesting factoid there, which is that the Seattle Seahawks are in the NFC West in their very first year in existence. And then 25 some odd years later, 30 years, they find themselves back in the NFC West after several decades in the AFC. But with 14 teams in each conference, it's a really weird schedule. Both the Bucs and the Seahawks, those first 2 years, they play each of the teams in their conference once, and then they play each other, and that rounds out their 14-game schedule. So there's no interconference play other than the one game, and there's no sort of respect for the divisional structure where they play twice in a row or twice against each team in their division. It's a totally sort of once against each team in your conference. And I'm guessing that was for 2 reasons. That was probably, first of all, to get those expansion teams some exposure so that over the course of those 2 years, they would play every single other team in the league, and also to make sure that every team in the league got a shot at an easy game against those expansion teams.
Yeah, I think it was probably a lot more the former than the latter. The real interesting thing that I didn't really know about till I looked too much into this till I looked into it for this episode specifically, was the owner that was awarded the franchise originally in 74 was a guy by the name of Tom McCloskey, who was I'm assuming McCloskey, who was a Philadelphia area businessman for $16 million. He tried to buy the Eagles, didn't work each time. he wasn't happy ultimately with the deal with the NFL and backed out of it, over a year before the Bucs were ever set to play a game. And they turned to Hugh Culverhouse, who ended up becoming the owner of the team. He was from the Jacksonville area, had tried to buy the Rams at one point. So just kind of an interesting situation where the guy they sort of awarded the bid based on being the owner was long gone by the team. The time the team finally took the field in 1976.
They start playing in 76 and they go 0-14 in their first 14 games, their first 14 game season. And then they go 2-12 in their second year. And that includes losing the first 12 games. So they start off, and this is famous, and I think it was an NFL Network special. They're 0-26 before they ever win a game, almost 2 full seasons. So really just sort of an embarrassment to everything, I guess, the first couple of years. They're coached by a guy by the name of John McKay, who ends up being their coach for 8 full years and does eventually see some success with them. And we talked about this years ago when we did our Tampa episode, but McKay is sort of very much I don't know whether you describe him as purposefully funny or just very negative, but some of his quotes about his team in those first few years are hilarious.
Yeah, and the one you always hear, the famous one, is when they asked him about his team's execution, and he says, "I'm in favor of it." He had been a really successful coach at USC. I doubt anybody would have been successful in this role, although, like you mentioned, he did see some success with the Bucs. But this was also not again, this was the first expansion in the NFL since 10 years earlier. You think about how much the NFL had changed in those 10 years. There wasn't a blueprint the way there is today. I mean, most recently in hockey, a couple of expansion teams have seen immediate success. The Vegas Golden Knights went to the Stanley Cup finals in their first year and then won it in their fourth year or whatever. Some NFL teams have had some success. There wasn't a lot of thought back then put into how can we set these expansion teams up to actually be good. And in an era with no free agency, with no salary cap, they kind of had their pick of old guys that current teams didn't really want or unknowns. And it was like, well, that's what you have. And now you figure it out from there. So as comically inept as they sort of were at the start, they weren't really set up by the league to be any better than that.
A couple of quotes from John McKay, sideline quotes or interviews, and I just kind of took some notes as I was listening. There's one clip of him on the sideline just saying, "We can't run, we can't pass, we can't kick, we can't play defense. Other than that, we're perfect." And then he later says, "Can't win at home, and we can't win on the road. What we need are some neutral site games." And then I have here, and I don't remember, I took notes on this a couple days ago. I have just gutless / brainless written down. And I think what that was is he said to the sideline to one of his coaches, he said something along the lines of, "These guys are just gutless. And the one who aren't gutless are brainless." And you wonder with him, obviously the things he was saying were not very nice. But you wonder if sort of part of that was meant as a way to deflect it so that by saying things like, well, I'm in favor of my team's execution, you wonder if that was sort of an effort and almost to deflect from his players a little bit so that it was, it was harsh and it was biting. I mean, calling your players gutless and brainless is not, it's not a compliment, but I kind of feel sometimes with him like maybe he kind of tried to diffuse the negativity with some humor and sarcasm.
Yeah, I think that's there's something to that where he's making these comments, he's getting the attention. It's not like he's saying to the press, well, so and so really didn't hustle on this play, or so and so really has no business in the league. It's like you've lost 20, 21, 22, up to 26 straight games. You can't go, well, we're out. I mean, nowadays a coach would go, well, we're competing. We think we're in it every week. But like, people know what they're seeing. So you may as well control the narrative a little bit by having some fun with it, or at least appearing to have some fun with it. They're playing all these games in Tampa Stadium, which I didn't realize was built like 10 years before that. It looks like in 1964 or something along those lines. And then the capacity was expanded when they announced they had they were getting an NFL team. So it ends up being a normal NFL stadium. They played a few Super Bowls there. It becomes known as the Big Sombrero, which I never really understood why Chris Berman was saying that. And then you see the stadium from the outside and you realize, oh yeah, that's why he called it that, because it did really look like kind of a big
sombrero
like that. Yeah, a sombrero basically. And the other thing you sort of remember superficially about these Bucs teams is they're wearing these uniforms that I think now everybody is very fond of. And you look back at them and they are really nice. Like, they're very distinctive, but not in a bad way uniforms. It's what became known as the creamsicle orange with the white helmet with the Bucco Bruce orange logo in there. And, to be fair, the Bucs since then have really cycled through a lot of middling to bad uniforms. About 10 years ago, they went through a phase where the numbers looked like the numbers you'd see on like an alarm clock. Mm-hmm. And that, like, it got to a point with the Bucs, and we probably talked about this a little in the history of Tampa sports, and then with the 02 team even, they almost had to get rid of them because they'd just become so associated with losing. Yeah. Because they lost for 20 years. But that's sort of the backdrop, was like those gorgeous, you think of football in 1976 and this always trips me up when like you'll watch an America's Game or a video yearbook or something. And it's like, you're used to seeing clips of the Steelers against the Cowboys in the Super Bowl, or, on the AstroTurf at Three Rivers Stadium against the Raiders or even the Oilers or something like that. And then occasionally they'll show a clip, or if it's like an America's Game where they're going game by game, it's like, and then in week 13, they went to Tampa and it's like this sun grassy field and, Terry Bradshaw and Mean Joe Green against like these creamsicle uniforms. And you're like, it's so weird that was at the same time. Like, you know what I mean?
Well, and also you figure by 78, they've settled into where they're going to be as far as the division that they're in. And that's the Packers, the Bears, two teams that now as then are cold weather teams. The Vikings are still in Metropolitan Stadium. This is before they move into the Dome. And I believe that the Lions are probably still, are they in Pontiac yet? So in 78, the Lions are in Pontiac. I want to see, when did they move into the Silverdome? It's just they were there. Lions were actually So 74 was the Lions last year in Tiger Stadium. So they've been in they've been inside in the Pontiac Silverdome for a few years now. But still, 3 of the 4 teams are playing in really cold weather stadiums, and they're in. Meanwhile, the Buccaneers are in South Florida, orange uniforms, sun-soaked parks, like you said. So, yeah, to go from those really cold, dark, Midwestern football stadiums to Tampa, it really is a big contrast.
So I think we're ready to go into 78. This is coincidentally the year the league jumps to 16 games. So they'd gone 0-14 in 76. They went 2-12 in 77. We should start with the draft. But before we do that, one of the big differences specific to the 78 season is the offensive coordinator who comes in, and it's his only year with Tampa Bay. And that's Joe Gibbs, who comes in to take over. And, I'm not sure exactly why he took this job. He had been with St. Louis in 73 to 77. I guess it was a promotion. He was the running backs coach at St. Louis with the Cardinals. And he would soon depart for 2 years to the Chargers, the Air Coryell teams. And then by 81, he's the head coach in Washington. And by 82, he's a Super Bowl champion. But in 78, he finds himself in Tampa Bay. And there's a story that we can probably talk about after we talk about the draft and stuff. But the offense wasn't particularly good this year. It's not like, and he turned the offense around. But an interesting name to, on this. I had no idea he was with Tampa Bay in 1978 or otherwise.
Before we talk about the 78 draft, I just want to kind of make a few quick notes here about the previous drafts because the Bucs had the very first pick in both the 76 and the 77 drafts. I don't know how they determined it for 76, but in 77, I'm assuming it's obvious they were winless. I'm sorry, for 77, it's obviously because they were winless in 76 and Seattle wasn't. But in 76, with the first overall draft pick, they draft Leroy Selman, who's a defensive end and linebacker who actually ends up playing with the team all the way until I'm more of a defensive end. I guess he plays a little bit of linebacker, but really more of a defensive end. Plays with the team for 9 seasons. He's in the Hall of Fame for a long time. He was the only Tampa Bay Buccaneer in the Hall of Famer, 5-time All-Pro, 6-time Pro Bowler on the NFL 100th anniversary team. In fact, his brother actually is on the team for a while too. His brother Dewey Selman is also a linebacker and defensive tackle. He also joins the team in 76. He was drafted in the second round, and he's with the team from 76 to 81. So they draft the anchor of their defense in Leroy Selman first overall in 1976. And then in 1977, they draft a running back, a guy by the name of Ricky Bell, who had been, I guess had he been with McKay? Yeah, I guess he'd been with McKay at USC for the first 3 years of McKay's time there. I don't know if there was a restriction on freshmen playing yet, or if he or if he played. I don't know if he played 2 seasons with McKay, just 74 and 75, or whether he played with them in 73 as well. But they draft Ricky Bell first overall, and that's actually a little bit of in retrospect, not a great pick for a running back, because immediately after that, the Dallas Cowboys, who had made a trade with Seattle for the second pick, take a Hall of Famer in Tony Dorsett. So they do have a quote-unquote star running back starting in 1977, but it could have been Tony Dorsett.
So the Bucs, once again, by virtue of what happened in 77, are sitting on the number 1 pick. But unlike the year before, they've basically signaled that they're open to trading the pick. The Oilers had sort of said, we will match, or we will basically beat any offer. We want that first pick. They have their eyes on Earl Campbell, which obviously turns out to be the right move for them. The Bucs are trying to find anybody they can to basically give them a franchise quarterback, or not even a franchise quarterback, but just give them a quarterback in a trade. They don't really get any serious offers with that regard. Nobody's willing to give up a starting quarterback. So they do trade with the Oilers. They give their first pick up. They acquire tight end Jimmy Giles. They get the Oilers' first and second round picks in 1978, third and fifth round picks in 1979. So that's what happens. They end up with the 17th pick. We'll talk about that in one.
Before you get into that, let me just sort of speak real quick. Their quarterbacks were not great in 76 and 77. In 77, it was three different guys got starts: Gary Huff, Jeb Blount, and Randy Hedberg. Three guys I have to say I'd never heard of until about 45 seconds ago. The first year, and I think we've talked about this before, their starting quarterback for their 12 out of 14 games was actually Steve Spurrier, which is kind of interesting. But anyway, go ahead.
So just brief. So they trade back with the pick. The trade with Houston gives them the 17th pick. Oilers take Earl Campbell first. The next big name that gets taken is the Packers take James Lofton at number 6. Sort of stands out in modern times, although I don't think Clay Matthews went 12 to Cleveland. The one that really stands out to me is that the Cardinals took a kicker with the 15th pick in the draft. But Tampa, who is sitting at 17th now, actually takes what ends up being a very good player, not all of his career with the Bucs, and that is Doug Williams, the future Redskin quarterback, first black quarterback to win a Super Bowl. I believe at the time was the only black quarterback who was a starter in the NFL by the time Williams started with Tampa, but he becomes the first real franchise quarterback hopeful for the Buccaneers in 1978.
There was one other black quarterback at the time, sort of regular black starting quarterback, and that was a guy by the name of James Harris, who, like Doug Williams, had gone to Grambling. Harris had started his career in Buffalo, and then he'd been with the Rams, and actually had he starts most of the games for the Rams in 74 and 75. 74, he starts 9 games. 75, he actually starts all 13, and then kind of peters out. By the time Williams is drafted, Harris is coming into the end of his career. He starts 2 games for San Diego in 78, and then is basically just a mop-up guy for the Chargers in 79 before retiring. The interesting thing, just to sort of tie it together about James Harris, is he actually ends up going to Tampa Bay and being a longtime executive for the Buccaneers. So the Gibbs story I meant to mention, or I had said we'll mention, was so in training camp in 78, and it's 1978. It feels like the modern era, but the sort of last bastion from a player standpoint was black quarterbacks and black starting pitchers were seen as, and especially quarterbacks, and I'm not defending it, but they weren't fully over sort of it was considered like a legitimate stigma where, like, if you didn't want to draft a guy because you didn't want a black quarterback, that was seen as like a reasonable school of thought, is what I'm trying to say. Quarterback's coach was a guy named Bill Nelson, and this is from the book Rise of the Black QB by Jason Reed. There was an incident in training camp where Bill Nelson, who was the quarterback coach, began berating Williams in what would be described as going beyond coaching and becoming a personal attack. Joe Gibbs ran over and said that threw his clipboard down, pointed his finger in Nelson's face and said, "Don't you ever talk to him like that again. Is that clear?" And according to Williams, Nelson never confronted Williams in that manner again. So, obviously Joe Gibbs and Doug Williams would go on to bigger and better things in the 1987 season, but you see the early seeds of their relationship here in Gibbs's only year in Tampa and Williams's rookie year. And it's funny, first of all, growing up, when you learn about Doug Williams, you think of him as a Redskin because in addition to being the first black quarterback to start a Super Bowl, the first black quarterback to win a Super Bowl, and also the MVP of that Super Bowl, and guy has a crazy game. He throws is it 5 touchdown passes or 6 touchdown passes in that game? It's not 6, but it's quite a few touchdown passes, and you think of him more as a Redskin for that reason, and understandably so, but his real time is with Tampa Bay. He starts 81 games in his career, and only 14 of those are with Washington. So it's not as if and his good sort of years. He's never a Pro Bowler, Williams, but his best years, just from an on the field point of view, are definitely with Tampa. And then the other thing that I didn't realize, and maybe I should have, is that's where the relationship between him and Joe Gibbs really starts, because Williams, for 3 years between his Tampa and Washington years, is out of the NFL. I think he's probably playing in the USFL, right?
Yeah, he is with the Oklahoma/Arizona Outlaws in 84 and 85. And then he comes back to the NFL. I think I'm looking up the quote here. There's a quote from Doug Williams. He says, "I get this phone call from Coach Gibbs. He was the only guy who called me Douglas. Douglas, it's Coach Gibbs," he said. "How are you doing?" He asked me to come to Washington to be a backup. Now, at this point, I don't have a job. I said, "Coach, I can be any kind of up you want me to be." He said, "Okay." Bobby Beathard is going to give you a call. Bobby called. We agreed to terms. Obviously, he would take over for Jay Schrader. And like we said, he threw 4 touchdowns in that Super Bowl, by the way. 340 yards and 4 touchdowns. And
you got to believe that the foundation is built for that in that 1 year with Gibbs in Tampa.
Yep. So, we're obviously not going to go game by game here. And if you look at the roster, there's a lot of guys named Dave on it. That was the thing that jumped out the most at me. There are like 5 different guys named Dave on this roster. In the end, they finished, and I remember I said their offense wasn't anything great. They finished 7th defensively in points against allowed. They only allowed 16.2 points a game. They finished 25th of 28 in offense. So they had a pretty good defense. I mean, 28th is upper quarter of the league right there, or 7th out of 28. But then the offense was bottom of the barrel. And, as we go through some of these games and talk about the scores, they just couldn't score any points. They had a lot of games where they scored like 6 points. The other thing I wanted to bring up, it's a weird schedule. They played 14 games against the NFC. As I looked, the only AFC teams I saw them play in on this was Buffalo and Kansas City. Everything else was the NFC.
And that's interesting because by this point, they're out of that whole thing where they're playing every other team once, but for whatever reason, they must have kept them in that sort of weird thing. Because I did notice the thing that jumped out at me, just being who I am, they played the Giants twice. They played them twice early, too. They played them twice before mid-October.
Well, and that was because...
No, I was going to say they played the Vikings twice, but that's in their division, so that's a little bit of a different story.
So that used to happen back then because they would play the way it used to like crisscross, if you finished in 5th in, let's say, the NFC Central, well, there was no 5th place team in the NFC West. So you had to play the 5th place team. And that's, as I'm looking, the 2 teams they played in the AFC were Kansas City and Buffalo. I'm wondering if the year before those 2 teams had been 5th place teams as well. I'm wondering if that's like some weird, and we don't need to look too crazily into that, but I'm guessing that's why those 2 AFC games. Yeah, the 77 Chiefs went 2-12, so I have no hard time believing that they finished in last in their division that year. And then the 77 Bills went 3-11. So yeah, they probably played all the 5th place teams. So they played the Giants twice, and then they played the 2 in the AFC. That's probably what it ended up being. So, again, I don't know how much Doug Williams starts 10 games. He takes over as the starter. He starts 10 games.
Well, we should talk about that because that comes into play right away in the first game.
Go ahead. Yeah, the first game, which is against the Giants in Tampa.
And they are favored in the season opener against the Giants, which tells you, among other things, just how terrible the Giants were that year as well. It is an opening. It is here's something interesting. The coach of the Tampa Bay Buccaneers, John McKay. The coach of the New York Giants, John McVay. So,
and this used to confuse me as a kid.
Me too.
I thought maybe they were the same guy. That there wasn't there a Rich McKay who did something in some sports.
I think he was a broadcaster. Yeah.
Probably, yeah. This used to confuse me as a kid because I thought, oh, that guy was the coach of the Bucs, and then he became the coach of the Giants, but obviously not.
Rich McKay was an executive with the Falcons, by the way.
Okay, I don't know why I remember that name, but yeah. So they, and again, I mean, say what you will, they're coming off a 2-game win streak. The Bucs.
Well, and the Giants. The Giants. Yeah. This is again. We don't need to turn every podcast episode about a football team into the Giants, but this is a dark time period for the Giants too.
And back in 1978 as well. So yeah, what did you want to say about this first game?
So the opening game, it's the first game of the NFL season. It's actually on a Saturday night, September 2nd, 1978, and Doug Williams gets the start. His very first pass goes for a pick six. It's intercepted by a guy named Terry Jackson for the Giants, and then he's only 1-5. He's 1 for 5 in the game. Williams is, and then he gets injured and is out for, I believe, the next several weeks. I'll double check that. So yeah, while it's accurate to say that Doug Williams is given the starting job, he's not there for long because he almost immediately gets injured in the midst of Tampa Bay Buccaneers opening night loss to the New York Giants.
Yeah, and it's still like an age-old question of, do you start the rookie quarterback right away in case something like that happens where he gets hurt, or just gets so shell-shocked behind being a bad team. So obviously with Williams, it worked out better, all things considered, but it certainly did not get off to a very good start.
So just in case, I'm sure we'll weave it back in here, but Williams misses a game with his injury. He then plays the next 8 games in a row, and then he's injured again and doesn't come back. He's either injured or benched. I'll have to look at that, and doesn't come back till week 16. And there's some interesting things that go on around the Buccaneers quarterbacking situation that we can get to in a little bit. But suffice it to say, they lose the first game. They go to Detroit a week later, got another Saturday night game, 2 Saturday night games in a row. September 9th, they play against the Detroit Lions at the Pontiac.
I bet I know this. No, they're home in both of these games. I bet I know why. Because there was no Sunday night. There was no Sunday night football back then. They weren't going to play in the middle of the day in Tampa in September.
Yeah, maybe you're right. You're right. It's not. Those are both home games. You're absolutely right. Yeah, that could be it.
Yeah, that would be my guess. Now, you could just have them start on the road. Would be my suggestion, but I guess not. But yeah, I bet that's why.
So in the second game is they're quarterbacked by 2 guys actually. A guy by the name of Mike Borula, BorYla, and this is Borula's last ever NFL game. He had not played in 77, and then he had signed with Tampa Bay in 78. And in some of the previews that I had seen, he was listed as potentially being the Buccaneers starting quarterback that year, but he loses the starting job to Williams in the first game, or before the first game, and then goes on to play his second game, and then immediately after that game against the Lions, he had been with Tampa Bay. He'd been picked in the expansion draft probably, or it would have been a year before. But anyway, he's with Tampa Bay, misses the whole year with a knee injury, and then plays 1 game in 78, and then just all of a sudden figures he can't do it. So the guy who they thought was going to be the starting quarterback going into the season, and then the guy who ended up being the starting quarterback, who's Williams, both are injured after 2 games. So they're not off to a great start.
But they then do turn around and have a couple of games worth of success. They go on the road in week 3, and they beat the Vikings in Minnesota. 16-10 is the final score. They're actually up the whole way. I guess they're down 7-3 at one point, but they win. Doug Williams is back. He does go. Good God. Doug Williams is back. He goes 5 of 19 for 63 yards is his passing line, but that's enough for them to win. Do you know who started it? Oh, I guess it's 78. It wasn't that shocking. I was going to say Fran Tarkington started at quarterback in this game, but it was his last year as the full-time starter.
Yeah, it's his last season.
Yeah, so Tarkington starts in the game. Fran Tarkington and Tommy Kramer being on the same team was pretty crazy to think about. So they win that game, and then they keep the good times rolling. They finally win a game at home the next week against Atlanta. They win this game 14-9. So again, you see they're not really scoring any points, but they're getting the job done. Williams is again 6 of 23 for 74 yards, but that's enough to win the game. And the Bucs are 500 for the first time in franchise history.
And then on October 1st, they go up against the Vikings again, who they had just beaten. And it is the first game ever sold out at home for the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. So that means it is the first game not blacked out in the local market.
Wow, that's interesting. And you wonder how much of that was related to the fact that they'd won a couple of games in a row. They'd won a game at home 2 weeks earlier. And in come this same Vikings team. They play the Vikings again. So they play them, 2 times in 3 weeks. And this one's kind of interesting because I mentioned some of those passing totals. In this game, Williams actually puts up good passing total. Well, not a good completion percentage, but he throws for 300 yards, but he's intercepted 3 times. The Vikings really beat the crap out of them. It's 24-7. They lose. They're soundly beaten, and they're back below 500. But the next week, they put up 30 points against what must have been a really bad Chiefs team out in Arrowhead Stadium. They win 30-13. Tony Adams starts the game for Kansas City. I don't know who that is, to be honest. Williams gets to start again, throws for 226 yards, and the Bucs stay at 3-3.
And just also something to keep in mind, I talked about how they sell out for the first time in that game. They actually, for the year, they finished 5th in the league in attendance. So they're not unpopular. They're drawing good crowds, and especially now that they're starting to win a little more, the Tampa area is starting to take notice.
Yeah, and then again, the next week they go up. They go on the road, as it were, to Giant Stadium, to the 2-year-old the 2-year-old Giant Stadium in the New Jersey Meadowlands, and they play the Giants for the second time this year. And this time it's the Giants who beat them. The Giants win 17-14. Larry Zonka runs for 2 touchdowns, and Williams goes 7 of 27 in this one. My God. Doug Williams goes 7 of 27 for 100 yards. The Giants, a guy named Jerry Golston, goes 2 for 2 for 18 yards. And Pisarcik goes 4 of 13 for 45 yards.
That's so the combined. Thing. These were when you had 2 bad or mediocre to bad teams playing in the NFL in the 70s, the late 70s, they could be some brutal games.
Well, nobody could complete a pass.
Yeah.
And it's not all because of the bump and run defense. Passing has gotten a lot better in terms of people being a lot better at it. Like, if you watch bad teams from back then, there are a ton of just a guy runs a 10-yard out route and the quarterback throws it at his feet. Like, it's.
You know what I think it was, and I'm not necessarily the biggest expert on this, but I feel like in those days there was not as much of developing a quarterback. Now, obviously, Lombardi developed Bart Starr and they developed Johnny Unitas, but like, if a guy was a mediocre to bad quarterback, that's just what he was. And if there was like no amount of coaching that could make a guy who was not a decent quarterback into a decent quarterback.
At least not any coaching they knew how to do at the time.
I want to say something more about this Giant game, because it kind of gives you an idea of, even though they're starting to come out of it a little bit, just how snake bitten this team was. In 1978, they still hadn't had a 100-game runner. But a guy named Jimmy DuBose becomes the first Buccaneer ever to run for 100 yards in a game, and that's 109 against the Giants in this game. Only 4 plays after he hits the 100-yard mark, Williams throws an interception to Harry Carson, and in trying to tackle Harry Carson, DuBose injures himself, never plays another game in the NFL. So they get a guy who finally rushes for 100 yards, and then literally probably 5 minutes later, his career is over.
A couple of games after this, I think 2 more home games after this for the Giants would be the miracle at the Meadowlands and the bottoming out of their franchise that they, from there it was all uphill for another 7 or so years till they won the Super Bowl. The last game we need to go like quite game by game on for a while after this is they then come home, they play the Bears in week 8. They beat the Bears 33-19 at home. So another, sign over a division team that they've beaten the Vikings once. They beat this Bears team once. They get themselves even at the halfway point of the season. They're 4-4, which when you consider that they were the last 2 years at the halfway point of the season, they were 0-7 both years.
Yep.
And they were a combined 2-24. They were combined 2-22. Yeah, 2-24 their first 2 years. At 4-4, you're probably thinking, hey, if we could go 7-9 or something like that, that's a big jump up. So, they really did. 4-4 is a good start for a team like this.
They go to Lambeau to play Green Bay on October 29th in a divisional matchup. They're 4-4, and the Packers are 6-2. One of the news articles I found from right before this game, it said Green Bay versus Tampa Bay, and then in quotes, or not in quotes, but and then sort of like the sub headline, amazingly, it's a big one. So maybe for the first time, the Bucs are in a game that's considered a matchup between 2 good teams. They lose
Did you
9.
see what Green Bay's record was going into this game?
6-2.
Yeah. I didn't. Who knew the 78 Packers were 7-2 at one point? They fall off the map after this. They finished one more game.
They finished 8-7-1. Yeah, they lose the next 3, then they tie, and then they beat Tampa. So going.
But yeah, sorry. Go ahead.
After jumping out to a 6-2 record, the Packers can beat nobody but the Bucs for the rest of the season.
This is the star era of the Packers coaching, not play.
Yeah, exactly. Tarkenton's still in the league, but not Bart Starr. They lose on a last-second field goal despite not completing a pass or getting a first down in the first 37 minutes of the game. And they lose 9-7 on a last-second Green Bay field goal. This kind of sort of to my point about this era. I'm sorry. Let me find this box score here. 7 turnovers in this game between 2 ostensibly, halfway decent teams. The Packers are quarterbacked by a guy by the name of David Whitehurst. And yeah, just another brutal game for Doug Williams. 5 for 17.
Now, so the next week, they go to Los Angeles and they lose another close game. They lose 26-23. They've been down 17-3, actually, and they clawed their way back into it. They tied the game up in the fourth quarter. Was John McKay's son on this team?
I was going to get to that in a minute.
Okay, because it says 23-yard touch from John McKay, and at first I was like, The coach didn't play, did he? I was like, no, all right. And then I'm looking and I'm like, he went to USC.
So here's let me get into that now. There's an article that I found in the LA Times from right around this or sort of early November period, and it's talking about how, and obviously, you know, the real leaders are a couple of the guys on defense, Selman and the other Selman, and a couple other guys. But this article highlights some of the USC guys who McKay had brought in, and that includes a tight end by the name of Jim Obradovich, Danny Reese, who was started as he was a punt returner for the team, a guy named Jeff Winans, who started as a defensive lineman in Buffalo, and then McKay got a hold of him and turned him into an offensive lineman. And then two other guys that I want to mention, John McKay, who is an on-again, off-again starter as a receiver. They used to call him JK, but in interviews, the coach McKay refers to him as my son Johnny. And then a quarterback by the name of Mike Ray, who they actually had been in Oakland, had been Kenny Stabler's backup. And but yet the Bucs trade for him when some of these other quarterbacks get injured. They actually end up benching Doug Williams for a lot of the end of the season and starting Mike Ray. The interesting thing about Mike Ray is that he's kind of a footnote in Raiders history because at this point, Kenny Stabler, who'd won a championship for them, what was that, 76, the Raiders won the title, so just a couple of years previous. Stabler's the starter, and I guess this is right. Madden's still there. Yeah, when does Madden leave? Madden leaves after the 77 season, I think. So, yeah, I think Madden.
I don't remember exactly, but
Madden leaves after Madden leaves after the 77 season. Let me see who's coaching the Raiders in 78. I think that was it Flora? Oh no, Madden's still there in 78. 78 is Madden's last year, and then it's Tom Flores after that. But anyway, the Raiders trade away Ray to the Buccaneers, so they need a backup now to Stabler. So they go out and sign Jim Plunkett, who had been with the Patriots. And all Plunkett does over the next several years is win 2 more Super Bowls with the Raiders, both in Oakland and then later in Los Angeles. So had John McKay not wanted to bring in a USC guy to be one of his quarterbacks, it's very possible that Jim Plunkett never would have been a Raider and never would have won 2 Super Bowls for them. So yes, to answer your question, John McKay's kid is on the team.
So sort of the next few the rest of the games, there's a few, things we can talk about. They beat Buffalo in 2 weeks later after. So I think they lose to, what was the last game we talked about when they lost to the Rams? Then they lose to Detroit the next week. They get beat pretty badly. They come home, they go to Buffalo, or they play at home against a bad Buffalo team and win. They win 31-10. They're 5-7, and then the rest of the way they lose. Their total points the rest of the way 3, 7, 3, and 6 are the amount of points they score, including a game they play good defense. They lose 14-3 to Chicago, 17-7 to Green Bay, 6-3 to the Packers, and then 17-10 to the Saints in the last game of the year. So the other team doesn't score more than 17 points in any game, but they don't break the 10-point mark.
I have down here they lose 4 games by a combined total of 19 points. So if you flip those 4 games the other way, they're 9-7.
And this would have been, that 49er game is interesting because the 49ers are even worse. They were 2-13. They were 1-13 going into the game against the Bucs when they won the game they didn't score a touchdown either. 2 Ray Wershing field goals. Can you imagine sitting in that stadium, Candlestick Park, in December watching that game? This was the year before Montana, right?
The year before they drafted Montana, correct. I think Steve DeBerg is the quarterback that year.
He plays, and then a guy named Scott Bull plays half the game, it looks like. But that's the for the 49ers. So, they lose a bunch of close games at the end because they can't score any points. They lose 7 of their last 8 after being 4-4. And ultimately ending up 5-11.
And from what I read, it was basically after the Ram loss when they went to 4-6 that any shot at the playoffs was basically done for.
Yeah, well, that's also back in the day of. You only have 5 playoff teams, so there's only 2 wild cards in the late 70s. And that, so you really can't afford it. You got to be at least probably 11-5 to feel pretty good about your playoff chances there.
I want to just mention a couple of individual things. This is the year that they have both their first All-Pro and their first Pro Bowler, both on the defensive line. Leroy Selman, who we talked about a little bit earlier, who's in the Hall of Fame and was their first ever draft choice. So he's the first Tampa Bay Buccaneer, and he had started to get discouraged. He had said, "If there's a light at the end of the tunnel, I can't see it." As far as his time with the Bucs and whether they were going to win or not, but he makes second team All Pro in '78, and then goes on to have some really good years and double-digit sacks a number of years. He's a Pro Bowler the last 6 years of his career, all the way from '79 to '84. He's one of the all-time great defensive players of all time, as is evidenced by the fact that he is on the NFL 100-year anniversary team that they named a couple years back. And then the Pro Bowler is a nose tackle, a guy by the name of Dave Pear, P-E-A-R, just like the fruit. And this is his only Pro Bowl year. He's in the league for 6 seasons. He ends up, unfortunately, and he's still alive, but he ends up being one of these guys who has a lot of injuries later in life, and kind of ends up being very bitter towards pro football and the NFL. He's one of these guys who says he wishes he'd never played, et cetera, et cetera. And it's always sad to hear that, but that's another guy who's worth mentioning, Dave Pear, first ever Pro Bowler in Tampa Bay Buccaneers history.
So, all things considered, it's the best year they've had by a good amount. 5-15 or 5-11 after 2-12 and 0-14. It's their least losses, even in a season they played 2 more games. Mm-hmm. Aftermath, Gibbs leaves. We talk about that. 79, it's this weird anomaly that you just, until you look into it, honestly, until the internet, I had no idea about this. I knew the Bucs were bad, and I knew they were horrendous when they started, and they were pretty much bad until the mid 90s. And then you look and you go, wait a minute, in 1979, the Bucs got to the NFC Championship game and could have played the Steel Curtain Steelers in the Super Bowl.
Can you imagine?
The Rams was a weird enough visual, let alone the Bucs.
Well, and they lose on 3 field goals. So once again, their defense is great, but their offense can't do a damn thing. Can you imagine where was that Super Bowl that year? Because I think that was that's obviously it's the last Steelers victory of the Steel Curtain teams. That Super Bowl is at the Rose Bowl. Can you imagine just the contrast between the Steelers and the creamsicle Bucs at the Rose Bowl in Super Bowl 14?
Yeah, so and obviously the subject was 78. The next year they start out 5-0. Their first loss is to and again, the next year, by the way, their first home game was a Saturday night at 8:00.
Yeah, so there must have been a trend here.
Yeah. Their first loss was actually at Giants Stadium in week 6 to the 0-5 Giants. They were 5-0. They lost to the 0-5 Giants in what would have been the first win of the George Young era, I guess, in 1979.
Yeah.
I'm guessing Phil Simms might have started that game. So they lose to New Orleans. They're 5-2. They get up to 7 and they're actually 9-3. They played the Giants again later that year and beat the crap out of them. So they're 9-3, and they lose their last 4 games, actually. Now they lose one of them 23-22 to the Vikings. They lose the last game of the, or they win the last game of the year, rather. Here, their last 3 games, they lost 14-0 to the Bears, 23-7 to the 49ers. And then the last game of the year, they beat the Chiefs 3-0 in the last game of the year, which I'm guessing clinched them the division. Yeah, they finished tied with the Bears for the division, and that ends up getting them the tiebreaker. They end up with the number 2 seed in the NFC, actually. So that not only did they play in the conference championship game, that conference championship game was at home. They beat the Eagles in the playoffs. The Eagles were, a year away from their Super Bowl run. The Bucs not only get into the playoffs, but beat the Eagles in their first ever playoff game. And then they come up short against the Rams in the next round. They lose 9-0. And that, by the way, was their first and only playoff victory until 1997.
Wow.
Now that he got them back to the playoffs a few times, I want to say in 81, they were back in the playoffs. They lost to the Cowboys 38-0 in the first round.
Yeah, that was the
82.
That was the game before Dallas lost in the Dwight Clark catch game to San Francisco.
That's right. 82 in that weird strike year. They were 5-4. They got in. They lost 30-17 to the Cowboys. By 83, they're 2-14. 84, 6-10.
And that's
McKay's
when
gone.
That's when McKay's gone. Yeah.
And then you're into the late 80s where they stink. But they did have those couple of playoff runs, and like you said, one game, a 9-0 game away from making the Super Bowl in 1979.
Yeah. All right. Well, another random team in the books. We did a good job.
If we get like the 2015 Bucks next, I'm really going to be upset. Like another Bucks team, not one of the. I mean, the 2002 one, we got the Bucks team that won the Super Bowl, but we need a baseball. We need an older team. We need something different next time. But it's always more interesting than you think it's going to be. But still,
yeah. No, I mean, I definitely learned a lot. I don't want to delve too much. I don't want to end on too negative a note, but it's funny because sometimes you read about these guys who are, who had kind of sad endings to their careers or their lives, and maybe you wouldn't have known about it otherwise. So that's always kind of interesting to see, among other things. So, All right. Well, we'll be back next time with a topic that was pre-selected and not one that was foisted upon us by a random number generator. But thank you for joining us, and until next time, I'm Dan Newman.
And I'm Andrew Newman. Goodbye, old sports.
This podcast is part of the Sports History Network, your headquarters for the yesteryear of your favorite sport. You can learn more at sportshistorynetwork.com. Hey there, sports history fan. This is Arnie Chapman, a.k.a. the Football History Dude, and I hope that you enjoyed this recent episode presented by the Sports History Network and were able to learn some good old-fashioned sports history knowledge nuggets. I started the Sports History Network back in 2020 with the mission to help podcasters find a community of like-minded sports history nerds, as well as helping aspiring podcasters to start their own shows. We have a little bit over 30 shows on the network right now covering all sorts of sports history, but as far as I'm concerned, we're just at the toothpick in the ocean moment, that can't even figure it out because there's so much more coming. We wanted to create the ultimate headquarters for sports yesteryear, starting with Podcast Network and our website, but we're going to continue to move into other mediums as well. And here's the cool part, because we want you to be part of our team. So if you're interested in starting your own podcast, or maybe being a guest on one of our shows, or who knows, maybe even writing an article for us over on the website. Seriously, all you got to do is reach out to us on the contact page over at sportshistorynetwork.com. You can be as technologically savvy as a Neanderthal tapping on a stone trying to figure out this whole hieroglyphics thing back in the day. Again, it doesn't matter, because even if you don't understand the whole podcast space, we have a production team that can pretty much help you out with doing everything. All you got to do, head over to sportshistorynetwork.com, head to the contact page, fill it out. That message goes right to me, and I'll reach out to you as soon as I can. But for now, dude, I'm through if you're through.